What are we doing today?
We invite you to the first episode of our podcast. Today we'll be talking with Sandra about surfaces. Sandra works on creative projects and together with her team creates custom products that aren't in our catalog. And besides that, let me add, she also has an enormous amount of knowledge on a variety of topics, including surfaces. That's why we're going to talk about it today. Here I am.
The main downside is definitely the price. And then there's also the issue that if any damage occurs, and it often does because the surface is used improperly, for example, if rollerblades, cleats or high-heeled shoes are used on it which cause mechanical damage, then repairs can be quite expensive. The critical fall height, and so surfaces are used in accordance with regulations in order to cushion a child's fall from a certain height. So a child is allowed to fall from a high platform. But when they do, they should land softly enough to prevent any injuries, especially permanent injuries to their body. Any loose surface, meaning not just sand, but also bark or gravel, actually excludes people who use wheelchairs rather than being inclusive.
Hello, Sandra.
Hello, Marija.
Before we started recording, we talked about our childhood memories, about how we recorded ourselves on these old plastic toy radios. And I will also go back to those times because we are more or less from the same generation. I remember when there was a metal swing set in front of my house standing on a concrete sidewalk. And my first question is this, can you still do things like that? Is that allowed?
Who doesn't remember playgrounds like that? Basically, there was a swing like that in almost every neighborhood, and the main goal of playing on it was to swing it so hard that it would tip up on end. And underneath, of course, there was wonderful asphalt, concrete paving stones, or simply nothing at all. Would that fly today? To put it briefly, no. There are still some projects where the architect or investor forgets that under the swing, even though the free fall height is relatively low, usually around 130 centimeters, it's still a piece of equipment with a large swing arc, so you need to use a surface that will cushion a child's fall. Among other things, right here by these swings. You have to remember that.
So what types of surfaces do we have to choose from in that case?
Basically, we can divide them into two types of surfaces, natural surfaces and synthetic surfaces. And among natural ones, we very often have sand, which is quite common today. We have wood chips, bark and gravel. And when it comes to synthetic materials, here we can see growth mats, artificial grass and rubber tiles. Or the type, we also often see poured synthetic surfaces.
We at Buglo don't make or sell surfaces, but maybe you could give some advice to people who are creating a playground for the first time. What should they pay attention to when choosing a company that installs surfaces or when choosing the surface itself?
Most often when we receive a well-prepared site development plan, we try to clearly explain to our clients, investors and architects under which equipment a surface needs to be installed and under which it does not. We immediately indicate the recommended surface, which will simply be the best fit for the equipment that has been selected. But if someone is doing this entirely on their own and wants to do it according to the official regulations, then really the first question should be, what type of surface are we choosing? If we choose natural surfaces, a helpful resource can be a table that you can easily find yourself or that often appears in the product specification sheets for the equipment. It shows which fraction of these natural surfaces should be used. For example, with sand, the fraction is from 0.2 to 2 millimeters, and this table also indicates the thickness of the layer that should be applied. This way we also know that if we need to buy sand of a specific fraction, we usually can't just buy it anywhere. This is usually sand that has the appropriate certificates and approvals. And it's the same with all loose materials. And if we go in the direction of a synthetic rubber surface, then here as well, the same table will be helpful, only this time referring specifically to those materials. When it comes to the required thickness of this material, the table will tell us that. But when it comes to questions for the company, searching for the company, or asking yourself whether company A or B will do it, the key is really to ensure a comprehensive quote so that the company specifies what kind of parameters will be used in constructing the base, for example, for a poured synthetic surface. This needs to be clearly specified, the layers must be indicated, and the fractions of the crushed stone used for the base must be specified. We need to know what type of top layers will be used, that is, whether it will be SBR or EPDM, what color it will be, and whether it will be protected against UV radiation with the appropriate adhesives. And as always, the key point is that all these materials must have certificates and attestations confirming that they are actually suitable for use on a playground where our children will be playing.
So now we know what to pay attention to when choosing the surface. And tell me, if someone is coming to build a playground with us for the first time, are we able to coordinate not only the playground itself, but also someone who can install such a surface for the client?
These days, when we all have so little time and not everyone has to be an expert in everything, of course, we are prepared to offer someone comprehensive service in this area. So not only will we prepare a site development plan in which we will show what equipment, how it will be installed, what kind of construction, and at what cost we can offer, but we will also install this equipment and can also price and later execute the selected surface together, which is a safe, shock-absorbing surface, a fall.
I'll tell you, often when I browse social media and a new playground is being announced somewhere and people see that there's a natural surface, let's say sand, because I think it's mainly about sand, it gets a lot of criticism. People write that it's dirty, that they won't let their children play there. So tell me, is that true? Is sand like that really dirty? Does it, for example, have to be tested? How does it work?
The standard I mentioned, specifically 1176 to 1177, specifies what kind of sand should be used when designing a playground. And here we're talking about sand of a specific fraction, namely from 0.2 to 2 millimeters. And it really does have to be sand that has the proper certifications to prove it. That it contains no contaminants and that it is suitable for use as a safe surface for children. But because this is a loose surface and because it often appears in places like playgrounds that are not fenced in, we get freely roaming animals, wild animals, and unfortunately contaminants do actually show up there. Children also play with this sand. They dig all sorts of holes and pits, make sand castles, so the sand simply migrates. And as a result, its layer also, over time and through use, simply shifts. The layer changes, its thickness changes. So indeed, while it is natural and pleasant to use, and children enjoy playing in it and making sand castles, it does require maintenance, and the standards also specify how this sand should be monitored and cared for.
So maybe let's talk about how the sand should be monitored, whether it needs to be tested, and how to take care of it.
If we are designing a playground, the first thing we need to remember is to use sand of a specific grain size. And that's actually the first point that everyone, so the architect, the investor, the preschool teacher, or a private individual must remember that it can't just be sand taken from anywhere, because then it won't comply with regulations. So first of all, it has to be washed sand with a grain size from 0 to 2 millimeters. Secondly, it must have the appropriate certificate, a hygienic certificate, which confirms that this sand is suitable for use in a playground. These are the first two basic issues. As for inspections, the playground standard states that a playground must be inspected, meaning periodic, functional, and annual inspections must be carried out. And in reality, common sense also dictates that if an administrator is responsible for a playground, they simply have to inspect it, walk through and check whether there are any contaminants, whether there are any droppings or any glass or things like that. Then when it comes to public institutions, municipal units such as the Sanitary Inspectorate, Sanepid, come to the rescue. When they carry out an inspection, for example, in a nursery or kindergarten first, they check whether the sand is contaminated, meaning whether there are any droppings, glass or trash. Secondly, they check if there is an appropriate layer, that is, the thickness that actually complies with the regulations.
Recently, we were filming in Finland at playgrounds by Buglo, and while preparing for these recordings, I read about a study where in one Finnish kindergarten they replaced an artificial surface with a natural one. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I think it was bark. Additionally, they planted various plants around the surface and studied the microflora, or rather the microbiological diversity of the children on their skin and inside their bodies, before and after 3 months. After a few months, and it turned out that this microbiological diversity was much greater in the children after those 3 months. What does that mean? Greater immunity in kids when they come into contact with such a natural surface. So maybe it's not so bad after all, right?
I'll be honest with you, when you look at the trends, despite everything, there are more and more of these in our country and probably even more in Scandinavia, but it's changing here as well. We're starting to move towards, or maybe return to, these natural elements because, as you said, these are aspects that used to be overlooked. I think today this biodiversity and the fact that children have any contact with nature is not only fashionable but also desirable, and we should thank you. I would still recommend, whenever possible, working with natural materials.
That's right. Exactly. Maybe let's talk about these trends. Do you see any trends not only in Poland but also worldwide regarding surfaces? Are the trends leaning more towards natural or artificial ones?
You know, about 5 years ago, the answer would have been simple. The trend was towards synthetic surfaces, meaning polyurethane was basically present in all tender procedures. Thank you. When observing the development trends among playground and surface manufacturers, that really was the direction things were heading. At that time, very colorful, very dynamic playgrounds were being created. There was a lot going on there. Today, because we are so strongly stimulated and there is so much happening around us, and children also have a lot of extracurricular activities, we can now observe trends that are more calming. A return to nature, a return to those natural elements, not just in terms of the construction of playground equipment, for example, a return to wood. We are also seeing a lot of interest in robinia wood now. It simply clashes with the idea of installing a synthetic surface underneath it because we're working with something very natural, very stylistically raw, introducing a colorful, attention-grabbing surface here. Even many officials are starting to dislike it.
It just doesn't fit, does it?
Exactly.
And so, tell me then, maybe going back to those trends, if we look at it by country, are there any trends, well, in Scandinavia, as you mentioned, there are those natural ones, but do you see any trends in surfaces elsewhere in Europe, for example?
You know, when it comes to our neighboring countries, the changes that happen there are actually just a bit slower. When it comes to the Czech Republic or Slovakia, we can see that the process of switching from rubber surfaces to natural ones is happening a bit more slowly, but it is definitely noticeable. And as for Europe, basically the trends there are similar to those happening in Poland. Of course, Scandinavia is leading the way when it comes to caring about naturalness. As for exotic countries, I think, in my opinion, it's still about half and half there.
So maybe let's also talk about these artificial surfaces, as I'll call them. What are their advantages?
One definite advantage is that you don't have to deal with ongoing maintenance. So you don't need to water them like grass, you don't need to fertilize them, and you don't need to replenish them like sand. So there is much less work to be done afterwards. And the final effect of such a project, for example, if someone wants to create a playground in a hotel, the visual result with a synthetic surface and steel equipment can really deliver a wow effect on the playground, because you can also use it as an extra play element, for example, by designing a hopscotch game.
Ponieważ można też ją wykorzystać jako element dodatkowej zabawy, projektując na przykład grę w klasy.
A minusy? And the downsides?
To przede wszystkim cena.
The main downside is definitely the price. And also, if any damage occurs, which often happens because the surface is used improperly, for example, if rollerblades, cleats, or high-heeled shoes are used on it, causing mechanical damage, then repairs can be quite expensive. If someone neglects it, the damage starts to spread over larger and larger areas. If no one takes care of the weeds, or cleaning off the dust and toxins, then the surface fades quite quickly, looks bad, and the dust ends up reaching our little users, because unfortunately that's what happens.
Dociera do naszych małych użytkowników, tak? No bo niestety tak to się dzieje.
And should these surfaces, the ground coverings, have a specific thickness, for example rubber?
Yes, we always select it. This doesn't just apply to rubber. Actually, the main parameter we work with here is the critical fall height. And so, according to regulations, these surfaces are used to cushion a child's fall from a certain height. So, a child is allowed to fall from a high platform, but when they do, they should land softly enough to avoid any permanent injuries or bodily harm. And specifically when it comes to sand, if we exceed the free fall height limit of 1 meter, then we already have to provide cushioning. And for sand, this means, for example, 30 centimeters, plus the standard recommends an additional 10 centimeters to account for what's called displacement or shifting of the sand as it's used. And when it comes to synthetic surfaces, the division here depends on the free fall height. The thickness simply changes accordingly. So, for example, if we have a free fall height of 3.1 meters, then the thickness of the layer is as much as 12 millimeters. Of course, these layers are made up of an SBR layer with EPDM on top. But all of this must comply with the test results.
So maybe let's explain what this free fall height actually is?
It's a parameter that should appear on the specification sheet of every piece of equipment. If someone is interested in a particular piece of equipment, they not only need to check the dimensions and the size of the safety zone, but also the free fall height parameter. And this is the value that tells the buyer from what height a child can fall from the highest point. If this value is 99 centimeters, it means that the grass surface is sufficient here. So, if a child falls from that height, according to research and regulations, the grass will cushion the fall and nothing will happen to them. If we exceed just 1 meter, we have to cushion the fall with another type of surface, such as sand, bark, gravel, or a synthetic surface.
And do you know exactly how the testing of free falls onto different surfaces was actually carried out? Meaning how they determined how how thick the surface layer should be?
This is handled by specialized companies based on the PNEN 1177 standard. And we saw such a test during one of the trainings. It's a test where they use a ball designed to imitate a child's head, which is dropped from specific heights. Because when you have a playground like this, it has platforms at different heights, meaning places where a child can climb up to 60 centimeters, 90 centimeters, 152 centimeters. And by dropping this ball, which has a built-in mechanism, often probably connected to a smartphone, after the ball hits the surface, information is displayed on whether the surface cushioned the fall. So the thickness is appropriate enough that when a child falls on their head, well, they suffer an injury, but it's not permanent, right? Because that's exactly what the standard addresses.
And we also talk a lot about inclusivity, about making playgrounds accessible to everyone. So tell me, what about children who use wheelchairs? It's probably not comfortable for them to move around on a sand surface, for example.
Any loose surface, meaning not just sand but also bark, gravel, in reality, for people using wheelchairs, is actually an exclusion rather than inclusivity. So when designing these devices, it's very important to make sure that you're not just creating equipment with ramps or those dedicated to people with disabilities, but you also have to give them the opportunity to actually access these devices at all. These devices. And here the best solution is either to use concrete paths that allow, for example, access to such a device. Often these ramps are very low, just 15 to 30 centimeters, and in this case, concrete paving blocks are a good solution. But if, for example, we're talking about a swing, then there needs to be a surface that simply allows these children to move freely in their wheelchairs. So, for example, we now very often see the use of grass reinforcement mats, rubber tiles or poured synthetic surfaces. In other words, something that is solid enough to give these people freedom of movement.
So that's another advantage of these artificial surfaces, that a child can move around in a wheelchair. And is it possible to combine different types of surfaces? Is that allowed?
The standard does not prohibit it. It does not recommend mixing them, probably more from a practical usage standpoint. If you combine a synthetic rubber surface with a loose surface, like gravel, there's no way to prevent the two from mixing, and the gravel will wear down the synthetic surface. So from the perspective of the material's lifespan, by designing it this way, we're simply shortening the life of the rubber surface ourselves. But the standard doesn't really address this, it doesn't prohibit it. So if, for example, we're working and creating a section using a natural surface, meaning we use sand, we mix it with bark, with gravel, in my opinion, it really looks good and it's absolutely in line with the regulations.
You mentioned that the main downside of a rubber surface is the price. So what should someone do, or what would you recommend to a person who only has a budget for the equipment but not for the surface?
And here what comes to mind is actually the process of carefully choosing equipment that does not require the installation of this safety surface. Importantly, it's not at all a small-scale matter or a limited variety of such equipment. Then, as I mentioned, when looking for such equipment, it's enough to set a filter in the search engine to look for devices where the parameter we've discussed, the freefall height, does not exceed 1 meter. And then all of these types of equipment can be installed on regular grass. Of course, the grass also needs to be well maintained. If that grass gets trampled down and turns into bare ground, then it also stops serving its purpose. And you just have to keep in mind that the swing from our childhood, from the 90s, sometimes, well, very often, has a free fall height that's not that high. But because the movement on a swing is compelled, in every solution involving compelled movement, there must be a surface that will safely cushion a fall.
Maybe we should also explain what forced movement is, because not all of our listeners might know.
We're talking here about various types of devices, essentially, to put it in the simplest possible terms, devices in which the child is set in motion. For example, we have a swing moving back and forth, or a slide where there's also forced movement, meaning the child slides down, and there also needs to be a safe space provided for them to slow down, so to speak. It's the same with the swing or with carousels. These are also movements where the child is set in motion, and the area must be safe enough and additionally protected with a surface that cushions falls. Those uncontrolled ones that result from the speed.
And tell me, Sandra, what about garage ceilings? Because we can also build a playground on them. And what kind of surface can be used there?
Now, these so-called green terraces, there's more and more talk about them. Even here in our country, the regulations have changed. And more often when designing on these ceilings, we try to use these spaces as biologically active surfaces, which means there has to be a green area there. And in fact, when we build them according to regulations, they are counted as 50% biologically active surface. So not only can we create a green zone there, but we can also a playground. But on the ceilings, we have to attach these devices in some way. So a concrete screed has to be laid, and the equipment must be permanently fixed to that screed. And now, the key point when it comes to the safety surface and the foundations is to make sure that it's done in such a way that a child can never dig down to those foundations, meaning either we make the layer thick enough, so for example those 40 centimeters of loose surface must be there, so that if a child falls from the swing, they never have a chance to dig down to it. But when we design these devices on rooftops or on green terraces, most often, for safety reasons, we still tend to go with synthetic surfaces. Because then we can be sure that even if the administrator forgets once or twice to replenish the loose surface, we know that a child will never be able to dig down to the foundation, because it is simply securely protected by the appropriate thickness of the synthetic surface.
What is a biologically active surface?
To put it simply, it's the specific part of the plot or property where various types of plants, including grasses, flowers, and other vegetation, can grow freely and naturally without significant restrictions. And as we mentioned earlier when discussing the flat roof, if we make sure to provide and maintain the necessary conditions for lawns, shrubs, trees, or even a small decorative pond to appear and thrive there, then that particular surface area is counted as 50% towards the total biologically active area of the property.
Can this type of surface be imposed from above? For example, if someone is building a playground? Or can the city, for instance, require that only a specific type of surface, like just a strip, must be used?
In general, you can really see that these trends are changing in many cities, not only when it comes to inclusivity, but also in terms of returning to nature. There are indeed functional and utility programs or guidelines from investors that specify what types of materials are recommended or welcomed for use in the project. Here, there are not only guidelines regarding the construction of equipment, but increasingly also about how much biologically active surface there should be. This is specified in percentages. More and more often, the type of surface to be used is also being mandated. So either someone mandates that we work strictly with natural solutions when it comes to surfaces, or, as is increasingly the case, synthetic ones are being used less and less. We most often observe these trends in large cities.
And do you, as a team, when you design a project for someone, do you recommend to the client what kind of surface should or could be used there, or what you would envision?
Most often, we try to take a comprehensive approach to the project, so we analyze not only the size of the playground and the budget, but we also strive to ensure that the playground is an integral part of the overall development. the design is done comprehensively so that it fits, yes, not only with the building but also with the entire land development so that it is consistent with the whole area. Here it's also worth taking into account the guidelines of the local land development plan. So in that case, we really try to recommend, if someone doesn't have personalized and specific guidelines here, then we actually advise using a particular type, both when it comes to selecting equipment and choosing the surface. Specifically states or clearly communicates what they expect or says that price is the most important key factor, then we actually tend to go for surfaces that are the cheapest possible solutions. In this situation, sand is often chosen, especially when someone wants to have a lot more equipment and does not necessarily want the available funds or budget to be spent on the surface itself.
And taking into careful and thoughtful account all of your vast and extensive experience, both in your professional work and involvement with playgrounds, as well as in your important role as a mom who regularly and lovingly takes her sons to various playgrounds, what is your favorite type of surface?
You know, honestly, I think grass is the option I remember most fondly, and it's the first one that comes to mind. But of course, it's obvious that it can't be used under those large structures that they love so much. Among others, my own kids are at that age now, so more and more often I would go for bark, wood chips, or sand here. And when it comes to synthetic surfaces, I actually prefer not poured rubber, but growth mats. It's really a combination. On one hand, it's a synthetic material, but on the other, grass grows through it. So as I said, that's my favorite type of surface.
Czyli to, co powiedziałam, że jest moją ulubioną nawierzchnią.
Tell me, have you recently worked on, or are you currently working on something that really stands out in this regard, creating a nice, aesthetically pleasing whole?
Yes, you really hit the mark with that question, because right now we're working on a project at one of the Polish zoos. And there, the project naturally required the use of natural surfaces, but honestly, the visual effect of the entire development using several types of natural surfaces, I'll tell you which ones in a moment, the overall effect is really something. It's beautiful. It not only blends with the equipment, but also with the entire outdoor space, with the buildings, the animal enclosures, and the pathways. Everything looks really cohesive and very natural. And we used 3 types of surfaces there because there's bark, there's natural grass, and there's a green grass reinforcement mat through which the grass grows. So we've used both synthetic and natural surfaces when it comes to grass. There's also bark. We also created a sensory path using natural materials such as bark, pine cones and sand, which encourage experiencing the world barefoot. In other words, something natural. And we really hope that the final result will be met with the same positive reception that we're enjoying today.
You probably can't reveal the location of this playground yet, but I hope that soon we'll be able to show it off.
I can absolutely promise you that you'll definitely be the first to know if we actually manage to make it happen in this form.
Great.